The snow wasn't just falling. It was a weapon, a silent sideways blade slicing through the night, and Lillian Hayes was right in its path. She couldn't feel her legs anymore. The wind had ripped through her wool skirts, past her skin, and had frozen the very hope in her bones. Her hands, bound in front of her with thick barn twine, were a constant, nagging reminder. This was no accident. This was a sentence. She'd stopped screaming an hour ago. What was the point? The men who brought her here, the ones who followed the hollow, holy words of Elder Harrow, were long gone. Their hoofbeats had vanished into the blizzard, swallowed by the same white silence that was now swallowing her. The elder's voice echoed in her mind, a cold sermon in the wilderness. This is not exile, child. This is correction. Correction. A pretty word for a death sentence. The Lord was supposed to see her through it, he'd said. Or he wouldn't. Right now, the only thing she could feel was the cold. It was everything. It was the only God in this valley. She stumbled, her shoulder cracking against a snow-hidden rock, and slid to the ground. There were no tears. Nothing inside her was warm enough to melt ice. She could just let go. It would be so easy. Close her eyes, lie back, and let the white blanket become her shroud. Let the world fade. But as the edges of her vision flickered, showing her flashes of her husband's last breath, the metallic taste of blood, a different feeling sparked in her gut. It was something older than pain, hotter than any fire. It was rage. She pictured Elder Harrow at his pulpit next Sunday, his face a mask of pious sorrow, telling the congregation that poor Sister Lillian had simply vanished. Just like the others. Just like all the women who asked too many questions, who refused to be silent, who refused to be possessions. No, she wouldn't be another ghost in his sermon. She would be remembered. She forced herself to her knees, then to her feet, leaning against the rock. The wind howled, but for the first time, she felt like howling back. But just as she found her footing, a light flickered in the storm. At first, she thought it was her mind breaking, a final, cruel hallucination. A lantern swinging in the blizzard. It was impossible. No one came to this pass in winter. It was a graveyard for forgotten cattle trails and forgotten women. The light grew brighter, resolving into two shadows on horseback. They were moving slowly, deliberately, cutting through the storm. One man held the lantern high. The other dismounted with a speed that defied the conditions, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he rushed toward her. A voice, sharp and low, cut through the wind. "It's a woman." He was on her in seconds. She felt the fabric of her shawl being torn aside, and a gloved hand pressed against her throat. For a terrifying second, she thought this was just another part of the correction, a final, finishing touch. But the hand wasn't choking her. It was searching. "She's alive," the voice said, a note of disbelief in it. "Caleb, get the blankets, now." The other rider, older and heavier, moved with the slow certainty of age. He reached her, his voice a calm rumble. "Wrap her tight. She's not going to last long like this." Strong arms slid under her back and knees, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Her frozen body screamed in protest, but then she was pressed against a wall of warmth. It was the wool of a man's coat, smelling of pine sap, horses, and something else, something human. Her cheek rested against a solid chest. Her eyes fluttered open for a single, fleeting moment. She saw a young man's face, his jaw clenched so hard she thought it might crack. Snowflakes were caught in his eyelashes, and his brow was furrowed not with fear, but with a searing, desperate focus. He wasn't looking at her like a problem. He was holding her like she mattered. It was the last thing she saw before the world went completely, utterly black. But as she faded, a single, terrifying question echoed in the darkness. If these men weren't from Mount Mercy, then who were they? And what did they want with her? She was trapped in a nightmare of fire and ice. One moment, she was burning, adrift in a sea of fever. The next, she was drowning in a cold so deep it felt like the grave they'd left her in. Voices drifted in and out. A woman's hand, gentle, wiping her skin, the smooth, cool touch of salve on her cracked lips, a low humming, a hymn she didn't recognize, one that sounded like comfort, not condemnation. Then the nightmare would shift, and she'd be back in the chapel at Mount Mercy, with Elder Harrow's voice thundering down at her. Proud, disobedient, dangerous, a woman who needed to be led, a woman whose sin was wanting to choose her own path. When she finally surfaced, it was to the soft crackle of a real fire. She blinked, her eyes struggling to focus on a high, wood-paneled ceiling. She was buried under a mountain of heavy quilts that smelled of cedar and lye soap. Across the room, a window showed a world still buried in snow, but the light was soft, gentle, morning. A rocking chair moved in the corner, pushed by a phantom hand. The door creaked open, and a woman entered, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. She was tall, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. Her hands, holding a tray, looked like they had spent a lifetime kneading bread, stitching wounds, and holding things together. She didn't speak. She just set the tray down and placed the back of her hand against Lillian's forehead. "Still warm," she murmured, her voice raspy but kind. "Glad you're awake. You've been here 2 days." Lillian tried to sit up, a bolt of pain shooting through her body. The woman's hand was on her shoulder in an instant, gently pushing her back down. "No rush, sweetheart. You're safe now. I'm Eliza Bear. This is the Hale Ranch." The Hale Ranch. The name meant nothing to her. "The young man who found you," Eliza continued, pouring steaming tea into a mug. "Caleb. He's my boy. My boy." The words hung in the air. Lillian remembered the face in the storm, the jaw set like steel. "And Gideon Hale. He owns the land. He was with him." She handed the warm mug to Lillian. "They were checking fences when they saw you. Thought you were a deer at first. Collapsed in the snow." A wave of shame washed over Lillian. That's what she was, an animal, left to the elements. "I wasn't supposed to survive," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. Eliza's expression didn't flicker. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. She just looked Lillian straight in the eye, her gaze as steady as a mountain. "Well," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "you did." The simplicity of it was like a slap. There was no judgment in it, only fact. You did. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent. But inside this room, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Lillian Hayes was not alone. She was safe. For now. But she knew Elder Harrow. She knew the men of Mount Mercy. They didn't just abandon their corrections. They made sure they were seen through to the end. They would come looking, not to save her, but to finish the job. The question wasn't if, but when. The fire in the hearth was a quiet, living thing, its warmth a gentle comfort against the lingering chill in her bones. Lillian lay still, watching the shadows dance on the cedar walls. Every muscle ached, her ankle throbbed with a cold so deep no fire could touch it, but the pain was a reminder. She was alive. Her gaze drifted to the nightstand, a pitcher, a tin cup, with a faint wisp of steam still rising, and a folded linen towel, its corner embroidered with tiny, uneven violets. A work of care, not perfection. She reached for it, her hand trembling, then stopped. Did she have the right to touch something so gentle? The door opened again, but this time it wasn't Eliza. It was a man, tall and broad, with snow still dusting the shoulders of his coat. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the space he was in. When he saw she was awake, he removed his hat, revealing graying temples and eyes the color of old leather. "You're awake," he stated. It wasn't a question. Lillian managed a nod, her throat too raw to speak. "I'm Gideon Hale," he said, his voice as even as the horizon. "We found you near Split Rock Pass." He crossed the room, poured her a cup of water, and held it to her lips without a word. The water was fire and ice, a shock to her system. When she was done, he took the cup. "You've been here 3 nights, Gideon said, his gaze analytical, assessing. Eliza's been keeping you alive. But it was Caleb who pulled you from the snow. You owe your life to him, not me. Caleb. The name echoed again, the young man with the fierce, protective eyes. I don't know how to thank him, she whispered. Don't, Gideon replied bluntly. He didn't do it for thanks. He turned to the fire, poking at a log, sending a shower of sparks hissing up the chimney. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. I don't know what happened to you out there, Gideon said, his back still to her. And I don't need to. Folks come through this valley for all kinds of reasons. Most of them aren't good. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Could she trust him? Could she tell him the truth? The words felt like stones in her throat, heavy with shame and terror. They left me, she finally managed, the words barely audible. The men from Mount Mercy. The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Gideon straightened, his whole body going rigid. He turned, and though his face was a mask, the air around him had changed. It had gone cold. I know the place, he said, his voice dangerously low. Too well. He didn't ask for details. He didn't offer sympathy. He just gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of grim understanding, and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. The quiet click of the latch was louder than a gunshot. Too well. What did that mean? What history did this quiet, formidable man have with the monsters who had left her for dead? She had escaped one cage, but she had the terrifying feeling she might have just walked into another. Later, Eliza returned. The older woman's hands were gentle as she helped Lillian wash, her touch firm but kind as she combed the tangles from her hair, careful of the bruises on her scalp. She brought a thin, hot soup, and it tasted like a memory of a home Lillian had never had. The quiet routine was a balm, but Lillian's mind was a whirlwind. Gideon's words, too well, circled and circled. That evening, a hesitant footstep sounded in the hall. Lillian turned her head just as Caleb appeared at the threshold. He was taller than she remembered, his quiet eyes the color of a storm-swollen river. He held a pile of clean linens and a simple nightgown, holding them out awkwardly, like a boy offering a fistful of wildflowers. Ma said you might want something fresh, he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. Thank you, she said, her fingers brushing his as she took the clothes. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. He started to leave, then paused in the doorway. You looked dead when I found you, he said, the words coming out in a rush. I didn't think you'd make it. I almost didn't, she replied, her voice steady. He gave a short, jerky nod, his Adam's apple bobbing. Well, I'm glad you did. And then he was gone, the door closing with a care that seemed out of place with his rough hands and shy demeanor. Lillian lay back, the clean linen cool against her skin. This ranch, these people, they were a puzzle. Gideon's hidden anger, Eliza's knowing silence, Caleb's fierce gentleness. They had saved her, yes. But why? What did the people of the Hale Ranch have to fear from Mount Mercy? And what would they do when Elder Harrow came to collect his property? Because he would come. That was the one thing in this world she knew for sure. The next morning, she felt a flicker of strength return. She asked Eliza if she could sit in the parlor, and the older woman agreed with a knowing smile. Wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, Lillian shuffled down the hall, each step a victory. The parlor was bright with winter sun, a fire crackling in the main hearth. Through the large window, she could see Caleb outside, splitting firewood with a powerful, practiced rhythm, each swing of the axe a clean, definitive statement. She sank into a rocking chair, the motion soothing. Her eyes fell on a small stack of books on a side table, a worn Bible, a collection of essays, and a leather-bound journal with no name on the cover. She picked up the journal, its leather soft and worn with time. She opened it to a random page. It was a woman's handwriting, listing herbs for healing, notes on planting seasons, a half-finished prayer. It felt intimate, private. It felt like a life. "Eliza," she asked, her voice quiet, "do you have any paper and a pencil?" Eliza, who had been watching her from the doorway, gave a slow nod. "I'll see what I can find." When Gideon came in from the morning chores, he stopped short when he saw her. She looked small and fragile in the big chair, but her chin was up. Her eyes were no longer vacant. They were watchful, alive. He tipped his hat in a silent greeting and walked on. He was a man of few words, but he understood what he was seeing. A stranger can change the geography of a place just by deciding to stay. And outside, as the winter deepened its hold, a different kind of storm was gathering on the far ridge. Elder Harrow was not a man who tolerated loose ends. The letter wasn't delivered. It was placed. Wedged between the porch rail and the front door latch, a single folded sheet of thick paper, stark white against the dark wood. There was no stamp, no seal, just a deliberate crease from the cold. Eliza Bear saw it at sunrise and her blood ran cold. She knew that handwriting. It was as familiar and as painful as an old, badly healed wound. Precise, arrogant. The script of Elder Amos Harrow. She didn't open it. She carried it inside with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated, and placed it on the kitchen table next to Gideon's coffee pot. He saw it, his jaw tightened, and he set his cup down with a sharp crack. "Mount Mercy!" he growled. "Harrow," Eliza confirmed. Lillian was in the parlor, a simple walking stick Gideon had carved for her resting against her chair. She was holding the old journal, tracing the faded ink with her finger, when Eliza and Gideon entered. The look on their faces was all it took. Her stomach plummeted. "They know I'm here," she said. It wasn't a question. "They always knew," Gideon corrected her, his voice grim. "This is just the announcement." He tore the envelope open and read the words aloud, his voice dripping with contempt. "Mr. Gideon Hale, it has come to our attention that you are harboring a woman found unrepentant and removed from her spiritual household for her own correction. That woman is Lillian Hayes. You are hereby urged in the name of Christian order and moral stewardship to return her to our custody by week's end. Failure to comply will be interpreted as an obstruction of spiritual discipline, and we will take such actions as are necessary to correct the situation. In the Lord, Elder Amos Harrow." The silence in the room was deafening. The fire hissed. Lillian's hands gripped the arms of the chair so hard her knuckles turned white. They still thought they owned her, like a stray cow. Gideon folded the letter with chilling precision and set it on the mantelpiece. "They won't get near you," he said, his voice flat and final. "Not while we're breathing," Eliza added, her arms crossed over her chest. But Lillian felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter outside. This wasn't just a threat against her anymore. She had brought this darkness to their door. Gideon grabbed his coat. "Caleb and I will reinforce the north gate. Eli should be back from town tomorrow. He can take the night watch." He stormed out, leaving a wake of cold fury behind him. Later that morning, Lillian couldn't stand being inside. Bundled in borrowed wool, she limped towards the barn. The air was so cold it felt brittle. She found Caleb hammering new planks onto a broken section of the fence, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "Shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low. "I needed air," she replied, "and I needed to see something solid being built." He grunted, turning back to his work. "They're coming for me," she said quietly. He didn't pause his hammering. "I know. They'll try to take me back." He stopped. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a history she couldn't read. "No," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "They won't." "How can you be so sure?" she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. He looked away towards the distant snow-covered peaks that hid Mount Mercy. He drove another nail into the wood with a single, violent blow. The sound cracked through the quiet air like a gunshot. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his back still to her, I saw what they did to my sister, and I didn't stop them then. The words hung between them, frozen in the air. His sister? Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She took a hesitant step closer. What happened to your sister? But a more chilling question screamed in her mind. Was she another one of Elder Harrow's corrections? Caleb didn't turn around. He just stared out at the unforgiving landscape, his shoulders tight with a grief so old it had become a part of him. Clara, he said, the name a ghost on his lips. 10 years ago. She refused to marry a man twice her age, one of Elder Harrow's most pious sadists. He finally turned to look at Lillian, and the pain in his eyes was a raw, open wound. They said she'd gone north, took a wagon to Idaho to live with distant cousins. That was the story they told at the pulpit. His voice cracked just for a second. But I knew she wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Not to me. He looked down at his hands, calloused and strong, and clenched them into fists. After she left, I went looking. I found her favorite shawl behind the chapel, stuffed into the woodpile like trash, and in the hearth, in the ashes of the elders' private meeting room. I found the torn-up pages of her letters to me. They hadn't even bothered to burn them all. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Lillian felt the cold seep back into her bones, but this time it came from within. She's not in Idaho, is she? She whispered, though she already knew the answer. Caleb's jaw was a line of granite. No, he said, his voice hollow. She's nowhere. Nowhere. The same word they used for all the others. The women who vanished, the wives who fell suddenly ill, the daughters who ran away in the middle of the night without a word. It wasn't a place. It was an erasure. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind was the only sound, a mournful cry that seemed to echo the grief trapped in the valley. Lillian slowly, deliberately pulled off her glove. Her hand was red from the cold, but it was steady. She reached out and placed it over Caleb's hand, where it rested on the fence post. His skin was ice cold. I'm sorry, she said, the words inadequate but all she had. He didn't pull away, he didn't flinch. He just gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, terrible truth. Something had just passed between them, a bond forged in the shadow of the same monster. That night, the parlor of the Hale Ranch felt like a fortress. Gideon sat in his chair, cleaning a rifle with methodical, deadly calm. Eliza sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking like a tiny, relentless clock. And Lillian sat at the table, a stack of blank paper in front of her. She picked up the pencil Eliza had given her and began to write. She wrote a name, Sarah Bell, then another, Mary Langley, and another, Ruth Cole, women from Mount Mercy, girls who had run away, wives who had gone to visit family and never returned. She wasn't just writing a journal anymore. She was making a list, an indictment. She was pulling ghosts out of the fog of Harrow's lies. She felt a presence and looked up. Caleb was standing in the doorway watching her. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't need to. He just leaned against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the list of names. I was thinking, he said, his voice quiet but clear. If you're going to write a book, you'll need a proper desk. I can build you one. By the window. Lillian looked from the list of the dead and missing to the face of the man who had pulled her from the snow. A man who carried his own ghosts. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she smiled. Not a big smile, but a real one. I think I'd like that, she said. From behind his newspaper, Gideon spoke without looking up. I'll pay for the ink. Eliza gave a quiet snort. You'll do no such thing. I've got enough ink in the cellar to write out the Lord's entire catalog of disappointments in mankind, with a special chapter for Amos Harrow. A soft laugh escaped Caleb, a sound so rare it felt like a miracle. For a fleeting moment the room was warm, safe, full of a strange, fierce hope. But as the fire burned lower, the truth of their situation settled back in. A letter had been sent. A line had been drawn. And Elder Harrow was not a man who made idle threats. He was coming. and this time he wouldn't be sending a messenger. The old winter barn stood skeletal against the gray sky, the wind whistling through the gaps in its weathered boards. But inside, there was a pocket of determined quiet. For days, Lillian and Caleb had worked, he with hammer and saw, she with a broom and a stubborn refusal to let the past have the last word. They were cleaning it out, shoring it up, turning a place of decay into something else. Caleb strode in, 2 fresh planks balanced on his shoulder, sawdust clinging to his coat. "Reinforce the east wall," he announced. "Won't stop a blizzard, but it'll stand against the wind." Lillian nodded, her gaze sweeping over the row of empty stalls lining the back wall. "That's enough," she said softly. They weren't just fixing a barn, they were building a refuge, a safe house, an idea. "We'll need more blankets," she said, thinking aloud. "And cots. If they come—" "They will," Caleb finished for her, his voice grimly certain. He set down the wood and picked up his hammer, the sound of his work a steady heartbeat in the cavernous space. Lillian walked to the back, running a hand along the dusty wood of a stall divider. She could almost see it. Women, huddled in the dark, breathing the free air of a place where they weren't property. It was just a barn. But in her mind, it was an ark. She turned back to Caleb. "You would be surprised how many women I remember from Mount Mercy," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The ones who vanished." He stopped hammering, waiting. "Sarah Bell," Lillian began, the name sharp and clear. "She was 15. She told Elder Harrow she didn't want to marry the man he'd chosen for her, a man older than her father. Her mother told everyone she ran off with a fur trapper. But I saw her the day before she disappeared. She was walking toward the ridge, alone." Caleb's grip on his hammer tightened until his knuckles were white. "And Mary Langley," Lillian continued, her own voice hardening. "They said she lost her faith and wandered off. I found pages of her hymnal, torn and burned, behind the chapel woodpile." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "They called it God's will, but it wasn't. It was erasure." Caleb knelt, examining the rusted hinges on the main door. "That's what they want," he muttered, his voice a low growl. "To make people disappear so completely it's like they were never there at all." "Not anymore," Lillian said, her voice ringing with a conviction that startled even herself. Back in the ranch house, she spread her growing list of names across the parlor table. The list was no longer just names. It was becoming a chronicle of stolen lives. Eliza placed a fresh jar of ink and a clean pen beside her. "They'll call you a liar," the older woman said, her voice matter-of-fact. "They'll call you mad for writing this down. Do it anyway." Lillian looked up, her eyes searching Eliza's. "You believe me? All of it?" Eliza poured herself a cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate. "Child," she said, her gaze dark with memory. "I was a girl in Mount Mercy once. I know what their silence looks like when it's been nailed shut." Before Lillian could process that revelation, Gideon entered, stomping snow from his boots. "We have visitors," he announced, his tone clipped. Lillian's heart seized. "Mount Mercy?" "No," he said, a strange look on his face. "Locals. A family from Carson Hollow." Words spreading. That afternoon, a young woman named Clara Jennings arrived, her 2 small children clinging to her skirts, their faces pinched with cold and fear. Her husband had died, and the elders were already pressing her to remarry. She'd heard whispers of a ranch where you could knock on the back door and not be turned away. Whispers of a woman named Lillian. While Eliza found bedrolls and Lillian made tea, no one asked Clara for her story. They didn't have to. It was written in the terrified set of her jaw and the way she flinched at every sudden sound. That night, as the women and children slept fitfully in the main house, the sound of Caleb's hammer echoed from the barn. He was still out there, in the cold and the dark, building. Lillian sat by the fire, her journal in her lap, trying to piece together the fragments of stories, the whispers, the half-remembered sentences of the women who were gone. She felt his presence before she saw him. Caleb stood in the parlor doorway, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "I added a latch," he said, "on the inside of the barn door, so they can lock it themselves if they need to." "That's smart," Gideon said from his chair. "But don't stay out too late, son. We need you sharp." "I know," Caleb replied, but his eyes were on Lillian. "There's room for 5 now. More, if we have to stack them." Lillian met his gaze across the quiet room. "It's not just a barn anymore, is it?" she said softly. "No," he answered, a flicker of something fierce and protective in his eyes. "It's a choice." He left as quietly as he'd come. Gideon looked from the empty doorway to Lillian. "He used to be quiet because he was shy," the older man observed. Now it's something else, something heavy." "He carries things that weren't his to hold," Lillian whispered. Gideon gave a grim nod. "Don't we all?" The next morning she was on the porch when the riders appeared. 3 of them, their dark coats stark against the snow, their posture radiating the smug authority of Mount Mercy. One wore the distinctive red scarf of an elder's enforcer. Lillian gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white, as Gideon stepped out to stand beside her. "They won't set foot on this land," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The riders halted at the fence line. The one in the lead, a man with a cruel, familiar smirk she recognized as Nathan, Elder Harrow's own son, raised a hand in a mocking salute. "We came for a peaceful word, Hale." "You can yell from there," Gideon called back. "Don't want trouble," Nathan shouted, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Just the woman. She's a stray from our flock." Lillian's blood turned to ice. "She's not yours!" Gideon roared, his voice echoing across the valley. "She never was." Nathan's smile widened into a predatory grin. "You'll regret this choice, old man." "Not today," Gideon shot back, and with a final dismissive glare, he turned and walked back into the house. The riders didn't cross the fence, not that day, but their message was clear. They knew, and they would be back. Later, in the quiet of the nearly finished barn, Lillian found Caleb checking the fuel in the lanterns. "They'll come again," she stated. He nodded. "And we'll be ready." "Do you really think we can stop them?" she asked, the question a whisper of her deepest fear. Caleb stopped what he was doing and turned to her. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag, his gaze direct and unwavering. "We don't have to stop them forever," he said. "Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" "For the others to see," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "For them to hear. If we hold the line here, maybe someone else will hold the line somewhere else. That's how it starts, Lillian. Not with a sermon, with a choice." She looked around the barn, at the reinforced walls, the clean-swept floor, the ladder leading to a safe loft. "You've built something incredible," she said. "So have you," he replied, his gaze dropping to the journal she now carried with her everywhere. "You just used paper and ink instead of nails." A new kind of hope, fierce and fragile, began to flicker in her chest, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that far away in the hills of Mount Mercy, Elder Harrow was also making plans, and he was adding a new name to his list. Not just a woman, but a ranch, and a boy who had refused to stay quiet. The night was unnaturally bright. The moon was hidden, but the fresh snow cast a stark, shadowless glow over the valley, turning the Hale Ranch into a high-contrast photograph of white and black. It was a listening quiet, a holding-its-breath quiet. Inside the house, the lamps were turned down low. Eliza moved like a ghost between the windows and the kitchen, checking the latches, her face a stoic mask. Lillian sat at the parlor table, her finished journal closed in front of her. Her hands were clenched so tightly around a pencil that it was a miracle it hadn't snapped. Tonight was not for writing. It was for waiting. Caleb was a coiled spring of readiness. He'd spent the day checking rifles, distributing ammunition, and walking the perimeter, his movements economical and deadly serious. He had made his peace with whatever the darkness would bring. Gideon had been on the roof earlier, a lonely sentinel against the graying sky. When he came down, he didn't speak. He simply placed a heavy, well-oiled six-shooter and a box of cartridges on the kitchen table, a silent order. Then came the sound, the one they had all been waiting for. The muffled, rhythmic beat of hooves on snow, growing steadily closer. Lillian shot to her feet, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She rushed to the window and saw them, a line of dark riders cresting the rise, stark silhouettes against the snow. 5 at first, then more, a dozen at least. There were no warnings this time, no pretense of negotiation, just long coats, grim faces, and silent, deadly intent. Caleb was at her side in an instant, a rifle in his hands, its metal cold and absolute. "They won't be talking this time," he said, his voice flat. "I know," she whispered. Gideon strode past them, his coat already buttoned, his hat pulled low. "Eliza, get Clara and the children to the root cellar. Now." He turned to Lillian. "Stay in the house. Stay down." "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Gideon stopped, his hard eyes locking onto hers. "I'm not asking you to hide, Lillian. I'm asking you to live." But she shook her head, a sudden, fierce certainty coursing through her. "They aren't here for you, or Eliza, or even Caleb. They are here for me. I will not be buried in a cellar while others fight for my life." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at her face and he knew it was useless. "Fine," Gideon snapped. "Back parlor. There's a hatch under the rug that leads to the cellar. If they breach the house, you go through it and you don't look back. Understood?" "Understood," she said. The riders reached the fence. One man dismounted and strode forward, his hands held open in a mockery of peace. Even at a distance, Lillian recognized the arrogant swagger. Nathan Harrow, Elder Harrow's son and cruelest disciple. The man she had personally refused to marry. The act that had sealed her fate. "It's a show," Caleb muttered beside her. Gideon stepped onto the porch, his own rifle held loosely at his side. His voice boomed across the frozen landscape. "That's close enough, Harrow." Nathan stopped, a sneer twisting his lips. "I've come for what belongs to Mount Mercy, Hale." "She belongs to no one," Gideon roared back. "She was promised to me," Nathan screamed, his facade of calm shattering. "She was left to die." Lillian shot back, stepping out from behind Gideon to stand on the porch, a small, defiant figure against the vast, hostile night. Her voice, though not as loud as the men's, was clear and sharp as breaking ice. "I was claimed, Nathan, never promised, and I refuse to belong to men who mistake cruelty for faith." Nathan's face contorted with rage, his eyes, burning with a zealot's fire, locked onto hers. He nodded slowly, a final, terrible judgment. He turned to his men and his voice was a whip crack in the cold air. "Take her." It happened in a heartbeat. Gideon's rifle was at his shoulder, the crack of the shot echoing like the sky splitting open. One of the riders' horses screamed and reared, throwing its owner into the snow. Chaos erupted. A second shot, sharp and clean, rang out from the barn. Caleb. He must have circled around. A rider clutched his shoulder and fell from his saddle. Another fired wildly at the house, the parlor window exploding inwards in a shower of glass. Lillian ducked instinctively as Eliza pulled her behind the heavy cast-iron stove. Gideon fired again. "Hold the line!" he yelled, and then, from the hills behind them, a new sound cut through the gunfire. A sharp, piercing whistle, followed by the thunder of more hooves, faster, more disciplined. Lillian peered over the stove just in time to see 3 riders galloping into the fray from the west, rifles raised. They weren't Mount Mercy men. One of them wore the badge of a U.S. Marshal. The tide turned instantly. The Mount Mercy riders, caught between Gideon and Caleb's fire and the arrival of federal lawmen, panicked. One dropped his gun, hands shooting into the air. Another was tackled from his horse by a deputy, and Nathan Harrow ran. Lillian saw him break from the chaos, sprinting for the dark tree line, his coat flapping behind him like the wings of a crow. Without a second thought, Caleb vaulted from the hayloft of the barn and gave chase, disappearing into the woods after him. Caleb, no! Lillian screamed, starting to run after him, but Gideon's iron grip caught her arm. Let him go, Lillian. It's his fight. But he's alone. No, Gideon said, his eyes on the dark woods. He's not. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, Caleb emerged from the trees. Alone. There was a long gash on his cheek, and his face was a pale, unreadable mask. He got away, he said, his voice flat. No one pressed for details. Not then. The marshal, a tall man with a weathered face and weary eyes, strode into the wrecked parlor and removed his hat. Marshal Roy Kavanaugh, he said, nodding to Gideon. Looks like your information was good, Hale. We've been wanting a reason to move on Harrow for months. Tonight, they gave us one. They'll be back, Lillian said, her voice hollow. The marshal looked at her, his gaze assessing. Maybe, he said. But this time, they didn't just threaten a woman. They fired on federal officers. The game has changed. Gideon stood by the shattered window, looking out at the trampled snow and the lingering wisps of gun smoke. They'll never come back the same way, he said softly. And in the ringing silence that followed, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle, Lillian finally allowed herself to believe it. They had held the line. They had survived the night. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the end of the beginning. The wind changed. You could feel it in the air, a subtle shift that had nothing to do with the weather. The attack on the Hale Ranch wasn't just a skirmish anymore. It was a declaration of war, and news traveled fast in the lonely valleys of the territory. In the days that followed the shootout, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the silence of fear, but of anticipation. Something had been broken open, and no one knew what would crawl out. Lillian stood alone in the barn, the morning light filtering through the bullet hole in the east wall. The writing desk Caleb had built for her was her anchor in the storm. Her journal lay open, its pages a testament to the ghosts she refused to let die. But she couldn't write. The words were stuck, trapped behind a wall of shock and adrenaline. Eliza was there, sweeping the floor with slow, rhythmic strokes, a simple, grounding act in a world gone mad. Haven't seen you write since the shooting, the older woman observed, not looking up. I'm not sure what's mine to tell anymore, Lillian admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Eliza stopped sweeping and leaned on her broom, her gaze sharp. Child, if you lived through it, the story is yours. You earned it. When Caleb appeared in the doorway, he looked tired, the gash on his cheek stitched neatly, a stark red line against his pale skin. He leaned against the frame, his presence a silent comfort. The marshal was here, he said finally. Harrow and his son have gone to ground, disappeared. They think they've headed north, maybe into Wyoming territory. Lillian's heart sank. So he got away. It's not over. No, Caleb said, his eyes meeting hers. It's not over. It just means we have time. Time. The word felt foreign. For so long, her life had been measured in moments of survival. What was she supposed to do with time? As if reading her mind, Caleb added, 3 more women arrived last night. Walked all the way from Carson Hollow through the woods. They heard about the fight. Eliza let out a long, slow breath. Lord have mercy. It's starting. Is that a bad thing? Lillian asked. No, Eliza said, a flicker of a smile on her lips. But it's going to get crowded. That afternoon, Lillian took her journal, the pages filled with names and fragmented stories, and spread them out on the long kitchen table. She began to organize them, not as a diary, but as evidence. She made 3 piles, the vanished, the fugitives, the survivors. Her hands trembled, but her mind was a shard of ice. This was bigger than her story. It had always been bigger than her. The new women were quiet, their eyes haunted, but slowly the ranch began to breathe again. Clara Jennings, the first to arrive, took the new women under her wing, her quiet strength a soothing balm. A young red-headed girl named Miriam, who refused to speak of where she'd come from, started helping Eliza in the kitchen. her hands finding solace in the rhythm of peeling potatoes and kneading dough. Each woman brought her own silence, her own ghosts. The barn filled with cots, the house filled with whispers that slowly, painstakingly, began to sound like conversations. Gideon had a map of the territory spread across his table, marking the towns where the women came from. A dark constellation was forming, with Mount Mercy at its center. "He's been running this shadow government for 20 years, Gideon said to Marshal Kavanaugh, who had become a frequent, grim-faced visitor. "Threats, extortion, disappearances. You step out of line, your wife suddenly takes ill, your daughter runs away. No one ever connects the dots." The marshal sighed, swirling the bitter coffee in his mug. "The problem, Gideon, is that faith communities have protections. Unless we can prove they've broken federal law, my hands are tied. He'll claim he was just trying to retrieve a lost soul from your ranch." Lillian had been listening from the doorway, her arms crossed. She stepped into the light. "Then we have to prove it's more than that," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. Kavanaugh looked at her, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes. "And how do you plan to do that, Mrs. Hayes?" She looked from the marshal's weary face to the map dotted with tragedy. Her gaze fell on her journal, lying on the edge of the table. "I'll make so much noise," she said, her voice low and steady, "that men like you can't pretend you don't hear it." He raised an eyebrow. "With what, a 6-shooter? "No," she said, picking up her journal and holding it like a shield. "With this." The days that followed found a new rhythm, a rhythm of purpose. The ranch was no longer just a refuge, it was a headquarters, a resistance. Gideon and Caleb built a new bunkhouse. Eliza organized the kitchen like a quartermaster, teaching the younger women to preserve food, to mend clothes, to be self-sufficient. And Lillian wrote. She wrote with a feverish intensity, pouring every memory, every whispered fear, every name onto the page. She wrote about the look in Elder Harrow's eyes when he stood over her husband's casket. She wrote about the sermons that twisted faith into a weapon of control. She wrote about Sarah Bell's favorite color and Mary Langley's laugh. She gave the ghosts their lives back. And she wrote about the snow, about the feel of Caleb's arms lifting her from her grave, about the fierce protective light in his eyes. One evening, Caleb found her asleep at her desk, her cheek pillowed on a stack of ink-smeared pages. He didn't wake her. He gently draped a blanket over her shoulders and left a fresh mug of tea to cool beside her. When she woke hours later, the house was silent, the lamp burning low. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, her words were taking root. The next morning, she bundled the thick manuscript into a canvas satchel. She and Caleb walked to the end of the long drive to meet the mail wagon. The air was crisp and cold, their breath pluming in front of them. She handed the heavy package to the mailman, a man with a face as weathered as the landscape. There were 2 addresses written on it, one for the editor of the Helena Gazette, the other for the Federal Office of Women's Welfare in Washington, D.C. The mailman tipped his hat. "Heavy package, ma'am." Expecting a reply? Lillian looked out at the vast, empty plains, then back at the ranch, now bustling with life. A faint smile touched her lips. "No," she said. "I'm expecting a reckoning." As they walked back to the house, Caleb looked at her, a question in his eyes. "You're not done, are you?" "No," she said, clutching the now empty satchel. "I'm just beginning." "You scared?" he asked, his voice soft. "Terrified," she admitted. He nodded, a slow, knowing gesture. "Good," he said. "It means it matters." That night, for the first time, there was music in the parlor. Clara Jennings, her voice soft but clear, led a hymn. It wasn't a song of judgment or fear, but of endurance. Lillian sat by the fire, listening, her work done for now. And for the first time since she'd been dragged into the wilderness, she didn't feel like a survivor who had escaped. She felt like a fighter who had found her fortress. The thaw didn't begin with the sun. It began with the sound of dripping water from the eaves, a gentle, persistent rhythm that spoke of change. The snow, once a hard, unyielding crust, softened and sagged, revealing the first patches of dark, rich mud beneath. Winter was losing its grip. Lillian stood on the porch, watching the road transform from a white ribbon into a slushy, rutted track. 3 weeks had passed since she'd sent her manuscript into the world. 3 weeks of deafening silence. But the fear that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a strange, calm resolve. Caleb joined her, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. He offered one to her, and their fingers brushed as she took it. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt charged with everything they had been through together. "There's green under the south fence posts," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Saw it this morning." Lillian managed a small smile. "I never thought I'd miss the sight of dirt." He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze on the distant tree line. "Funny how things start small," he said, "but they always come back." She looked at him from the corner of her eye. "So do people," she said softly. He didn't answer, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Later that day, Gideon found them in the barn, inspecting the new support beams Caleb had installed in the loft, which was now a dormitory for the newest arrivals. Gideon was holding a piece of paper, a telegram, in his hand. He looked different. The hard, grim lines around his eyes seemed to have softened. "Got word," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "From the Helena Gazette." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "They're publishing it," Gideon said, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. "The whole damn thing. They're calling it A Woman's Voice from the Valley of Silence. They're running it in serialized installments. The first one is already being typeset." "So soon?" Lillian whispered, her knees feeling weak. "They're hungry for it," Gideon explained, his eyes shining. "Whispers about Mount Mercy have been circulating for years, but no one ever had the proof. No one ever had the courage to speak. You didn't just light a match, Lillian. You threw a torch into a powder keg." Lillian looked at Caleb. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked on hers, and in them she saw a reflection of her own shock and a fierce, burning pride. "Are you all right with this?" she asked him, her voice trembling. "With your name? With everything?" He closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a shield. "Lillian," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've never been more proud of anything in my entire life." The dam had broken. A few days later, Eliza brought Lillian a formal-looking letter, its seal bearing the insignia of the U.S. Marshals. "Figured you'd want to see this first," she said, her tone carefully neutral. With trembling hands, Lillian broke the seal and unfolded the page. "Harrow apprehended near Snake River Crossing. Extradition to Helena underway. Will stand trial. Federal charges include conspiracy, kidnapping, and endangerment. Your written record was instrumental. The U.S. Marshal's Office extends its gratitude." More to follow. She stared at the words, reading them over and over. Apprehended, trial, instrumental. She handed the letter to Eliza, who scanned it once and gave a grimly satisfied huff. Took 'em long enough. But Lillian didn't feel the triumph she expected. She felt empty. That night she walked out to the creek, where the ice had finally broken and the dark water was flowing free. Caleb was already there, standing in the mud, watching the current carry the last remnants of winter downstream. The setting sun bled across the sky in hues of gold and rose. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice so quiet he barely heard it over the rushing water. He turned to her. "Back where?" "To Mount Mercy." "No," she said, shaking her head. "To before. I don't want a life where we pretend none of this happened. I don't want to be safe if it means being silent again." Caleb's gaze was steady, his eyes reflecting the fiery sunset. "You won't have to be," he said. "Not with me." She looked down at her muddy boots, her heart aching with a fragile, terrifying hope. "We could build something," he said, the words a hesitant offering. Here. She looked up, her eyes searching his. Is that what you want? He hesitated, not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it to reveal a rough, penciled sketch. It was a small house, just one room to start, with a wide porch and a window that faced the rising sun. In the margin, in his careful, blocky handwriting, were the words, "Lillian's desk goes here." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the drawing. You drew this? He shrugged, a faint flush creeping up his neck. I've been doing some thinking. It's beautiful, she choked out. No, it's not, he said gruffly, but it'll be solid. I figured we could add on, if you'll say yes. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, closing the small space between them, and pressed her forehead against the solid warmth of his chest. A breath she had been holding all winter, all her life, finally escaped her. His arms came around her, strong and sure, holding her tight against the world. I say yes, she whispered into the rough wool of his coat. They started the next day. Gideon donated the lumber. Eliza brought them a cast-iron skillet and a quilt she'd been saving for a special occasion. Clara and Miriam and the other women tied dried herbs to the doorframe for luck and protection. They didn't have a preacher or a church, but as they laid the foundation stones and raised the walls, they were making vows more sacred than any sermon. With every nail Caleb hammered, with every window Lillian cleaned, they were building a new life from the wreckage of the old. They buried a wooden box beneath the floorboards. Inside was Lillian's original manuscript, not as a secret to be hidden, but as a foundation. Their truth, planted in the earth, a seed for the future they were determined to build. One evening, they sat together on the steps of their still unfinished porch, watching the stars ignite in the twilight sky. They didn't need to talk much anymore. They had found a quiet place beyond words. There was peace here, but it would never be silence. Silence was the enemy they had fought and defeated. The next morning, the mail wagon arrived with a whole stack of letters. They were from women all across the territory, women who had read her story in the paper. Their letters all asked the same questions, in 100 different handwritings. How did you do it? How do you leave? How do you learn to speak again? Lillian sat down at her new desk, by the window that faced the dawn, picked up her pen, and began to answer them, one by one. The road into the valley had healed. The deep, muddy ruts of winter had given way to a path packed firm and lined with stones that Caleb had laid by hand. It was a road that now led somewhere, a place of refuge, a place of becoming. Lillian sat on the wagon bench beside her husband, their infant daughter, Hope, asleep in her arms. The spring air was soft, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Wildflowers exploded in color along the roadside, purple asters, yellow balsam root, and the fiery red of Indian paintbrush. It was a landscape reborn. They had not been back to this specific place, this high, windswept pass, in over a year. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop beneath the jagged rock bluff where he had found her. He looked at Lillian, his eyes full of a quiet understanding, but he didn't speak. This was her pilgrimage. She handed the sleeping baby to him and stepped down from the wagon. The air was thin and sharp here, a reminder of the cold, but it no longer felt cruel. She walked to the edge of the pass, to the very spot where she had collapsed. Tucked beneath a gnarled, stunted pine was a simple marker, a flat stone that Gideon and Caleb had placed there months ago. It had no name, no date, just 3 words, carved deep into the granite: "We remember you." Lillian knelt in the new grass and placed a small bundle on the ground. It held a sprig of lavender from Eliza's garden, a single white ribbon for purity and hope, and a folded page from her journal, the page with the list of names. Sarah Bell, Mary Langley, Clara, all the others. She didn't pray, not in the way Elder Harrow had taught her. She simply placed her hand on the cool, rough stone and closed her eyes, offering a silent moment of acknowledgement to the ghosts who now had a voice. Caleb walked up behind her, holding their daughter. "She's safe," Lillian whispered, not needing to look at him. "She's free." Back at the ranch, the world was humming with life. The bunkhouse was full, the barn had been expanded, and the laughter of children echoed from the creek. Clara Jennings, now a formidable organizer in her own right, was reading a letter from a woman in Helena who was using Lillian's articles to petition for new laws protecting women's property rights. Miriam was teaching a group of younger girls how to read, using the serialized stories from the newspaper as their text. The Hale Ranch was no longer just a ranch. It had become a movement. Lillian slipped away to her own small house, to the desk by the window. Pinned to the wall above it was the first yellowed, worn-at-the-corners column from the Helena Gazette. She opened her journal to a fresh page. Not all stories were for the newspaper. Some were for the heart. April 4th, 1883, she wrote. The wildflowers have returned to Split Rock Pass. I don't know if they grow from seed or from memory, but they are there. So are we. She paused, listening to the sounds of the life she had built. The scrape of a chair from the main house, Caleb's steady footsteps on the porch, the soft sigh of her daughter sleeping in her cradle. This was the sound of victory. She dipped her pen in the ink once more. They still write to me. Women from towns I have never seen, with voices that shake and hands that are bruised. I answer every letter. I don't give them advice. I don't tell them what to do. I just tell them the truth. You are not alone, and I ask them a question. She looked at the stack of unanswered mail on her desk. A letter from a young wife in Nebraska, a desperate plea from a girl named Hope, who kept her journal hidden under the floorboards of her father's church. Each one was a life, a story waiting to be told. She picked up the first letter and began to write, her words a beacon in the gathering dusk. Because silence was never what saved her. Speaking was. Telling the story, again and again, was the only thing that had ever broken the dark. And she knew that when the next woman, bruised and terrified, found her way up that long, winding road, Lillian would be there, waiting with a warm fire, a steady hand, and the one question that mattered more than any other. What is your name? Tell me your story. I will remember you. This story is a reminder that one voice, speaking the truth, can be louder than an army of lies. It's about the quiet courage it takes to stand up when everyone else is telling you to kneel. If you were moved by Lillian's journey and believe in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of survival, justice, and the unbreakable human spirit.